Technology councils credit humans with proving persistence equals discovery. Part 1. The chamber existed in a pocket of reality that shouldn't have been possible. It floated between dimensions, anchored to nothing, yet perfectly stable. Inside, beings from across the galaxy gathered around a circular table that stretched for miles. Some had bodies made of crystal, others were clouds of sentient gas. A few existed as pure mathematical constructs, visible only through specialized sensors. This was the Technology Council, and it met once every 1,000 years. Dr. Sarah stood at the entrance with her small team, trying not to look overwhelmed. She had seen many incredible things in her career as Earth's leading dimensional physicist, but nothing quite like this. Beside her, Dr. James clutched his data pad so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Their other two teammates, Doctor and Doctor, stared upward at the impossible architecture above them. "Welcome, representatives of humanity," a voice said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A crystalline being floated toward them, its body refracting light into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "I am Threshold of 7, Chief Arbiter of this council. We are pleased to include your species in our gathering." Sarah bowed, unsure of the proper protocol. "Thank you for inviting us. It's an honor to be here." Threshold of 7 made a sound like wind chimes. Sarah's translator identified it as polite amusement. "Your species has been spacefaring for only 3 centuries. Quite young by our standards, but you have shown remarkable enthusiasm for learning. Come, the session begins shortly." They followed the Arbiter into the main chamber. Sarah had read the briefing documents, but they hadn't prepared her for the reality. Hundreds of species filled the space, each more alien than the last. A delegation of beings that looked like walking starlight conversed with creatures made entirely of living metal. In one corner, something that resembled a small black hole communicated through gravity waves. The human delegation found their assigned seats. Sarah noticed the looks they received. Some species regarded them with curiosity, others seemed dismissive, a few didn't acknowledge them at all. "They don't think we belong here," whispered. "They're probably right," James muttered back. "Look at them. Some of these civilizations have been exploring space since before humans learned to make fire." "Then we'll show them what humans can do," Sarah said firmly, though she felt the same uncertainty her team did. Threshold of 7 called the session to order. The background noise ceased instantly. "Welcome, all gathered minds, to the millennial session. As always, we begin by sharing our greatest achievements and presenting our deepest mysteries." What followed was humbling. The beings of pure computational thought presented breakthroughs in quantum consciousness manipulation. They had learned to link minds across dimensional barriers, creating networks of thought that spanned realities. A species that existed partially out of phase with normal space demonstrated mathematical proofs in 11-dimensional geometry that made Sarah's head ache just trying to follow them. Species after species presented wonders that pushed the boundaries of known science. Each one also brought an unsolved problem, a challenge they hoped the collective intelligence of the Council might address. When it came time for the human delegation to present, Sarah stood on shaking legs. She activated their display, showing Earth's progress in dimensional field theory. Compared to what had come before, it felt painfully basic. "Humanity has successfully created stable wormholes up to 10 light-years in length," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We've also made progress in understanding dimensional resonance frequencies and their applications for faster-than-light communication." Polite acknowledgement rippled through the chamber. No one seemed impressed. Sarah sat down quickly, her face burning. "And now," Threshold of 7 announced, "we come to the grand challenge of this session, a problem that has existed since before many of your species took their first steps into space." The display at the chamber's center activated, showing complex equations that seemed to shift and change as Sarah looked at them. Her translator struggled to render the mathematical concepts into terms she could understand. The paradox, Threshold of Seven continued. For 15,000 years, this problem has stood unsolved. It represents the fundamental barrier to creating stable bridges without massive energy expenditure. Every civilization here has attempted to solve it. All have failed. Sarah leaned forward, her earlier embarrassment forgotten. The equations were beautiful in their complexity. The paradox seemed to prove that stable dimensional bridges required exponentially increasing energy the longer they remained open. It was a hard physical limit, like the speed of light. "The mathematics are sound," a representative said, its voice a chorus of harmonic frequencies. "We have devoted 2,000 years to computational approaches. There is no solution. Our greatest theorists have examined every angle," added a. "The paradox is woven into the fabric of reality itself. It cannot be circumvented." Other species murmured agreement. The paradox was a philosophical curiosity now, nothing more. A reminder that even the most advanced civilizations had limits. Sarah raised her hand. Threshold of Seven's crystalline form rotated toward her. "Yes, Doctor. Could we examine the original problem parameters and all the attempted solutions?" A ripple of what Sarah's translator identified as amusement passed through the chamber. Threshold of Seven made that wind chime sound again. "You wish to attempt the paradox, with your species' 3 centuries of dimensional science." Sarah felt her face flush again, but she kept her voice level. "We'd like to look at it, yes, if that's permitted." "Of course," Threshold of Seven said, and Sarah couldn't tell if the arbiter was being kind or condescending. "I will transmit the full database to your team. It contains 15,000 years of failed attempts across hundreds of civilizations. Perhaps fresh eyes will see something we have all missed." The way the arbiter said it made clear what everyone thought. The humans were wasting their time on an impossible problem, but if it kept them occupied and out of the way, why not let them try? As the session moved on to other topics, Sarah and her team huddled around their data pad, downloading the massive archive of information. James scrolled through the failed attempts, his eyes growing wider with each passing minute. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there are millions of approaches here. Every conceivable angle has been tested." "Then we'll test the inconceivable ones," Sarah replied. Looked up from his own pad. "The math is solid. Multiple species have independently the proofs. The paradox is unsolvable within known physics." "Known physics," said softly. She was the youngest of the team, barely 30, but brilliant in ways that sometimes surprised even Sarah. "That's the key word. Known." Sarah nodded slowly. "Exactly. Maybe we're missing something, or maybe the rules have exceptions." Over the following days, as the council session continued around them, the human team began their work. They started at the beginning, examining the fundamental assumptions underlying the paradox. Other delegates occasionally stopped by to check on their progress, usually with poorly concealed amusement. A named computational mind ascending seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive. It hovered near their workspace on the 3rd day, its form flickering with internal light as it processed information at speeds no human brain could match. "Your approach is unusual," it said. "You are retesting solutions that have already been proven ineffective." "We're checking the proofs," Sarah explained, not looking up from her calculations, "making sure we understand why they failed. But the mathematics are sound. We them computationally across every possible variable. There is no error." Sarah finally looked up. "Maybe the error isn't in the math. Maybe it's in what we think the math means." Computational mind ascending pulsed with what might have been curiosity. "Explain." "We have a saying on Earth," Sarah said. "If at first you don't succeed, try again. We don't stop just because something seems impossible. We keep trying until we find the way through." But this is not an engineering challenge, they said. This is a mathematical impossibility. The difference is fundamental. Maybe, Sarah agreed, but we won't know for sure until we've exhausted every option, and I mean every option. Computational mind descending watched them work for a while longer, then floated away. Sarah caught the sense that it found humans fascinating in the way a scientist might find a peculiar insect fascinating. Interesting, but ultimately limited. The work continued. The human team barely slept, rotating through shifts to maintain constant progress. They examined 17 different theoretical frameworks in the first week alone. Most were approaches other species had already tried, but Sarah insisted on verifying everything personally. "It's like they think we're crazy," James said one evening after a particularly long session. "The delegation actually laughed at us today. Actually laughed." "Let them laugh," Sarah said, rubbing her tired eyes. "We're not here to impress them. We're here to solve problems." "But Sarah," said gently, "what if they're right? What if we're wasting our time on something that's genuinely impossible?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, a tired but determined expression. "You know what humanity's best at, not being the strongest. We're best at being too stubborn to quit. That's gotten us this far. Let's see how much farther it can take us." Part 2. By the second month of the council session, the human team had become something of a curiosity throughout the chamber. Delegates from various species would pause their own important discussions to observe the humans at work, often with expressions that ranged from puzzlement to pity. Sarah had stopped caring what they thought. She was deep into the problem now, truly deep, in that way that only came when a puzzle consumed every waking thought. The paradox was beautiful in its complexity, a knot of mathematics and physics that seemed to prove its own impossibility. But Sarah had learned something important in her years as a scientist. The universe didn't care about proofs. It only cared about what actually worked. "I've found something," said one morning, her voice sharp with excitement. The team gathered around her display. "Look at this. Every attempted solution assumes the dimensional bridge exists in a single quantum state. It's so fundamental that nobody even questions it." James frowned, studying the equations. "That's because bridges do exist in single states. That's basic dimensional mechanics." "But what if they don't have to?" Pulled up a new set of calculations. "What if we're looking at this wrong? What if the bridge could oscillate between multiple dimensional frequencies?" Shook his head. "That would just create quantum noise, interference patterns. It would make the bridge less stable, not more." "Would it?" Fingers flew across her pad. "Every species has dismissed quantum noise as irrelevant background interference. But what if it's not irrelevant? What if it's actually the key?" Sarah felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. "Show me." They spent the next 3 days exploring this idea. It went against everything Sarah had been taught about dimensional bridges. The mathematics seemed wrong at first, contradicting established theories. But the more they worked on it, the more Sarah began to see the possibility hidden in the noise. Computational mind descending returned to observe them. They had become a regular visitor, seeming genuinely fascinated by the human approach to problem solving. "You are still working on the paradox," it said, its voice carrying a note of something that might have been concern. "The council session enters its final month soon. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge the limitations of the problem." "We're not done yet," Sarah said, not looking up from her calculations. "Doctor," they said, more gently than before, "I have processed every computation your species could possibly run. The number of remaining untested approaches is finite and small. Within your remaining time, you cannot examine them all. Then we'll work faster." There was a pause. When computational mind descending spoke again, its tone had shifted. "Why? Why do you persist when the outcome is mathematically certain?" Sarah finally looked up. "Because maybe it's not certain. because maybe everyone missed something, because on Earth, we have a long history of doing things that were supposed to be impossible. Such as flying, Sarah said. For thousands of years, humans couldn't fly. Heavier-than-air flight was considered impossible by our best minds. Then two brothers who ran a bicycle shop proved them wrong, breaking the sound barrier. Impossible until we did it. Faster-than-light travel. Impossible until we cracked it. Every time people said it couldn't be done. Every time humans did it anyway. Those were engineering challenges, computational mind ascending said. This is different. This is a fundamental law of reality. Sarah smiled. That's what they said about the sound barrier too. The fell silent, its form poolsing with complex calculations. Finally, it said, I do not understand your species, but I find I am hoping you succeed. As the session entered its final weeks, the human team's workspace became cluttered with empty coffee containers and sleep deprivation. They had tested thousands of approaches now, documented hundreds of dead ends, and found themselves circling back to initial insight about quantum oscillation. It's still not working, James said, frustration evident in his voice. The oscillation creates interference, just like said. The bridge destabilizes faster, not slower. What if we're oscillating at the wrong frequency? Suggested. We've tried every frequency in the viable range, countered. Nothing works. Sarah stared at the equations floating in front of her. There was something there, something just out of reach. The oscillation was key, she was certain of it now, but they were missing a piece of the puzzle. She thought about what computational mind ascending had said, about how every species had dismissed quantum noise as irrelevant, about how assumptions became invisible when everyone shared them. What if there is no single frequency? She said suddenly. The team turned to look at her. What if the bridge needs to oscillate across multiple frequencies simultaneously, not cycling through them, but existing in all of them at once? That's not possible, James said automatically. Then he paused. Wait, is it? They dove into the mathematics with renewed energy. The concept seemed absurd at first. A dimensional bridge existing in multiple frequency states simultaneously violated several established principles of quantum mechanics. But as they worked through the implications, a pattern began to emerge. It's like a chord, said excitedly. In music, you don't play notes one at a time. You play them together and they harmonize. What if dimensional frequencies can harmonize the same way? The calculations were brutally complex. They spent 5 days working through the mathematics, checking and rechecking every step. Other delegates began to notice the change in the human team's energy. The air of desperate persistence had transformed into focused intensity. On the second-to-last day of the council session, Sarah sat back in her chair and stared at the final equation. It works, she whispered. James looked over her shoulder, his eyes widened. Oh my God, it actually works. Ran the verification protocols 3 times, checked the math from a different angle. Every test came back positive. The equations held together. The bridge would be stable. The energy requirements dropped by a factor of 10,000. They had solved the paradox. We need to verify this externally, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm even as her heart raced. We need someone else to check our work before we present it. Who? James asked. Who here would take us seriously? Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. Someone who actually hoped we'd succeed. They found computational mind ascending in one of the council's side chambers, engaged in a discussion with several other. Sarah approached cautiously, not wanting to interrupt. The being noticed her immediately and floated over. Doctor, you appear agitated. We need you to verify something, Sarah said. Our calculations. We think we've found something, but we need to be sure. She transmitted their work to the computational mind ascending fell silent, its form flickering rapidly as it processed the information at speeds no human could match. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally they spoke. "This is impossible." Sarah's heart sank. "And yet," computational mind descending continued, "the mathematics are sound. You have found a solution that should not exist. How?" "We looked at what everyone dismissed," Sarah said. "The quantum noise. We treated it not as interference but as information. The implications," they said slowly, "are staggering. If this is correct, every species has been approaching dimensional bridges incorrectly for 15,000 years." "Is it correct?" Sarah asked, almost afraid of the answer. Computational mind descending's form pulsed with what Sarah had learned to recognize as intense excitement. "I am running verification protocols now. Initial results are positive. Doctor, I believe you should prepare a presentation for tomorrow's closing session." That night the human team didn't sleep at all. They prepared their presentation with meticulous care, knowing they would face skepticism from some of the galaxy's greatest minds. Sarah ran through the speech in her head 100 times, refining every word. As dawn broke over the pocket dimension, if such a place could be said to have dawn, Sarah stood at the window of their quarters and looked out at the impossible architecture surrounding them. "Nervous?" asked, coming to stand beside her. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if we made a mistake? What if there's an error we didn't catch?" "Then we'll be embarrassed in front of the entire Technology Council," said cheerfully. "But at least we tried. That's more than most people can say." Sarah laughed despite her anxiety. "You're right. Whatever happens, we gave it everything we had." "That's the human way," agreed. Part 3. The final day of the council session arrived with a sense of ceremony that Sarah could feel in the air. Delegates filled the massive chamber, taking their places around the circular table. The energy was different today, expectant. Word had spread that the humans had requested time to present findings on the paradox. Sarah caught fragments of conversation as she walked to the presentation platform. Some species were curious, others seemed amused. A few sounded openly skeptical that the newcomers could have accomplished anything meaningful. Threshold of 7 called the session to order. "Before we conclude this millennial gathering, the human delegation has requested time to present findings. Dr. Sarah, the floor is yours." Sarah stepped onto the platform, her team beside her. She looked out at the assembled representatives of hundreds of civilizations, beings who had forgotten more about science than humanity had ever learned, and took a deep breath. "Thank you, Arbiter. We've spent the past 6 months examining the paradox. We believe we've found a solution." The murmurs that rippled through the chamber ranged from intrigued to dismissive. Sarah activated the display, and the equations appeared in the air above her, rendered in a format that every species translators could interpret. "The paradox has stood for 15,000 years because every attempted solution made the same fundamental assumption, that dimensional bridges exist in a single quantum state. We question that assumption." A delegate spoke up, its voice like crystallizing frost. "That is not an assumption. It is a physical law. Bridges cannot exist in multiple states simultaneously." "They can if those states are harmonically related," Sarah replied. She expanded the equations, showing the mathematical framework they'd developed. "By oscillating the bridge across multiple dimensional frequencies at once, creating a quantum chord rather than a single note, we achieve stability through interference patterns rather than despite them." The chamber fell silent as delegates processed the information. Sarah could see the exact moment when the implications began to sink in. Displays lit up across the room as species ran their own verification calculations. A she didn't recognize spoke, its voice tight with what might have been excitement or disbelief. "The mathematics appear sound, but this is impossible. We would have discovered this. Someone would have tried this approach." Everyone dismissed quantum noise as irrelevant, said, speaking up for the first time. It was such a basic assumption that it became invisible. We didn't have that assumption because we're too new to have learned it yet. Computational mind descending floated forward. I have the calculations independently. The solution is valid. The humans have solved the paradox. The chamber erupted, not in celebration but in a chaotic mixture of disbelief, excitement, and fierce debate. Species began running their own tests, arguing over the implications, questioning how this could have been missed for so long. Threshold of Seven's voice cut through the noise like a bell. Silence. The chamber instantly quieted. The arbiter floated to the center of the room, its crystalline form refracting light in patterns that seemed more complex than before. In the 15,000 years of this council's existence, Threshold of Seven said, we have witnessed many breakthroughs, but this is something different. This is a solution to a problem we had declared unsolvable, a problem that every species here has attempted and failed to solve. The arbiter turned to face Sarah and her team. How did you accomplish this? Your species is young. Your understanding of dimensional mechanics is, forgive me, rudimentary compared to civilizations that have studied these principles for. What did you do that we could not? Sarah chose her words carefully. We didn't give up, that's all. We tested everything, even the things that seemed obviously wrong. We questioned every assumption, including the ones that seemed too fundamental to question. And when we found something interesting, we kept digging. Persistence, computational mind descending said. They call it persistence. It is a defining characteristic of their species. More than that, another delegate said, a being of living starlight whose name Sarah couldn't pronounce. They lack the assumption bias that comes with deep knowledge. Sometimes, not knowing why something is impossible is an advantage. Threshold of Seven made that wind chime sound again, but this time it carried a different tone. Respect, Sarah realized. The council must formally recognize this achievement. Doctor, your solution will be by representatives from 20 species over the coming weeks. If it continues to hold, as I believe it will, you will have given every civilization in this chamber a gift beyond measure. Over the following hours, as the session wound toward its formal conclusion, Sarah and her team found themselves surrounded by delegates eager to discuss their work. The dismissive attitudes had vanished, replaced by genuine interest, and in some cases, something approaching awe. The who had been skeptical earlier approached Sarah with what her translator identified as an apologetic posture. I doubted you. I believed the problem was impossible because I could not solve it. That was arrogance on my part. You were working with the information you had, Sarah said diplomatically. We just happened to see it from a different angle. A refreshing angle, they replied. Perhaps that is the true value of including younger civilizations in this council, fresh perspectives. As the formal session drew to a close, Threshold of Seven made one final announcement. In recognition of humanity's achievement and the methodology that led to it, the Council hereby establishes a new principle. We shall call it the Human Persistence Theorem. Sarah looked up in surprise. The theorem states, the arbiter continued, that in the pursuit of discovery, exhaustive empirical investigation of all possibilities, regardless of theoretical dismissal, can reveal solutions hidden by assumption bias. In simpler terms, as Doctor explained to us, persistence equals discovery. The chamber resonated, with sounds of agreement from hundreds of species. Furthermore, Threshold of Seven said, the Council recommends that all member civilizations review their unsolved problems through this new lens. Questions we declared impossible may simply be unanswered. The difference, as humanity has shown us, lies in whether we are willing to keep searching. The session concluded with a level of energy Sarah hadn't seen since the opening day. Delegates dispersed slowly, many still engaged in animated discussions about the implications of the human solution. As Sarah and her team prepared to depart the pocket dimension, Computational mind descending approached one final time. I have been processing an inquiry, they said. My species has 17 problems we declared unsolvable. We stopped investigating them centuries ago. I find myself wondering now if they are truly impossible, or if we simply decided they were. Only one way to find out, Sarah said with a smile. Indeed, Doctor, I believe your species will go far in this galaxy, not because you are the most intelligent or the most technologically advanced, but because you possess something more valuable. You refuse to accept defeat. That's the human way, Sarah agreed. We're too stubborn to know when to quit. The return journey to Earth took 3 weeks. Sarah spent most of it sleeping, recovering from the exhaustion of the past 6 months. But in her few waking hours, she monitored the networks and watched as news of their discovery spread across civilizations. Scientists from dozens of species were already applying the human persistence theorem to their own unsolved problems. Some reported breakthroughs within days. Others found their problems were genuinely impossible, but at least now they knew for certain, rather than simply assuming. And everywhere, a new phrase was entering common usage among spacefaring civilizations. When faced with a difficult problem, scientists would ask each other, "Have we tried the human approach?" It meant one thing universally: keep trying. Don't accept impossibility without proof. Test everything, question every assumption, and refuse to quit until you've exhausted every option. James found Sarah in the observation deck, staring out at the stars as they approached Earth's solar system. "Feels different now, doesn't it?" he said, "knowing we proved something the galaxy thought was impossible." "We didn't prove it alone," Sarah said. "We stood on the shoulders of 15,000 years of research. We just happened to look in a direction nobody else had." "That's underselling it," James replied. "We succeeded because we didn't know we were supposed to fail." Sarah laughed. "Maybe that's humanity's real superpower, ignorance combined with stubborn determination." "I'll drink to that," James said. "When we get home, first round's on me." Earth's moon came into view, and then the planet itself, blue and green and achingly familiar. Sarah felt a surge of emotion looking at it. That small world had produced a species crazy enough to solve a 15,000-year-old problem through nothing more than refusing to give up. The landing was triumphant. News of their achievement had reached Earth weeks ago, and the team was greeted as heroes. But Sarah found herself thinking not about the celebration, but about what came next. Because they had proven something important. Not just that the paradox could be solved, but that persistence itself was a valid scientific methodology. That sometimes, the path to discovery lay not in elegant theories or brilliant insights, but in the simple, stubborn act of trying one more time. At the press conference, a reporter asked Sarah what advice she would give to young scientists. She thought about the 6 months in the council chamber, about the skeptical looks and dismissive attitudes, about the thousands of failed tests and dead ends, about the moment when the solution finally clicked into place. "Don't give up," she said simply. "When everyone tells you something is impossible, test it anyway. When the math says it can't be done, look for the assumption that's wrong. And when you fail, document why, then try again. The only difference between possible and impossible is whether someone is stubborn enough to prove which is which." The phrase spread quickly, translated into hundreds of languages, and transmitted across the networks. Within a year, it had become one of the most quoted sayings in galactic civilization, right up there with ancient proverbs from species millions of years old. And somewhere in a pocket dimension between realities, in a chamber that hosted the Technology Council, a new inscription appeared on the walls. Written in a language that could be understood by every species in the galaxy, it read, "Persistence equals discovery, the human theorem." It would remain there for the next 1,000 years, a reminder of the time when the youngest species in the council taught the oldest and a fundamental truth. that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem is simply refusing to believe it's impossible at all.